everyone. So glad to be with you to take a few minutes to share with you a little bit of information and background about John the Baptist, who is personally one of my favorite characters in all of the Bible. I want to share with you his birth, his life, and his death just over the next few minutes so that you can get to know really a predominant figure, especially in the New Testament. Some background behind John the Baptist and where and how he was born. His parents, he was born into a priestly family. His father was Zechariah, and his wife Elizabeth was John the Baptist's mother. What's interesting about Zechariah and Elizabeth is that they had no children. They were barren; they couldn't have children, which of course is a sad and difficult thing. But even more so back in that day, when your kids are really your future, they were your retirement plan, they were your inheritance, all that sort of thing. And so they had no children. By all accounts, they were a faithful couple. Zechariah was a faithful and a good priest. And closer toward the end of his life, he's older. We're not told how old, but they are definitely older than most people would be when they would get pregnant. Zechariah is chosen to be the one who gets to go into the inner sanctuary of the temple in Jerusalem and offer incense to God. Now, this was a high honor. You were only chosen once in your lifetime to do it, and only one priest could go into the innermost part of the temple only once a year. And so most priests never even got the opportunity. And so Zechariah, as God's providence would have it, this particular year is invited to be the priest to go into the temple and offer incense to God. While he's in there, an angel who is Gabriel appears to Zechariah and essentially tells him that your prayers, you and your wife's prayers, have been heard. She is now going to be with child. He kind of laughs. He's like, "Are you sure?" He's like, "I'm not quite sure I can believe that. How am I actually going to know that this is going to happen?" And so Gabriel says, "A sign that will be to you is that once you leave this temple, you will not be able to speak until Elizabeth has a child." And so he leaves the temple. He's unable to speak. As it turns out, Elizabeth is pregnant. She eventually gives birth to a son. They ask what to name the child. Zechariah at this time still can't speak, and so Elizabeth says John. They look at Elizabeth and they say, "Well, that's kind of an interesting name because you have no relatives in your family by that name." And so they looked at Zechariah and says, "What do you want to call him?" And he writes on a tablet, John as well. And at that moment, he can then speak. Now, you can read all about John's birth story essentially in Luke chapter 1. And so that's who he's born to. Now, what's interesting about John is that he's actually related to Jesus. Elizabeth is related to Mary. We see that in Luke chapter 1, verse 36. We don't know if they're cousins, some sort of cousins, or perhaps maybe Elizabeth is the aunt of Mary, the mother of Jesus, but they are relatives, which means that John the Baptist is related to Jesus as a cousin of some sort. And so that is how John is born. Now, John, again, born into a priestly family, becomes the first prophet in almost 400 years in the nation of Israel. He is certainly a transitional figure between the Old Testament and the New Testament. He lived in a Judean desert outside of Jerusalem, and his main message was essentially this: that you need to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. John the Baptist is essentially the forerunner to Jesus, saying this Messiah is coming. Now, unlike Jesus, one thing that made John the Baptist different is that unlike Jesus, where he didn't go to the people would go out to the desert to John, and they would hear him and they would see what he was teaching, and some would follow him. Now, he also baptized people, which is why he's given the name John the Baptist or John the Baptizer. And so he would baptize those who repented of their sins and were looking forward to this Messiah. And so a significant thing about John is that Jesus calls him the greatest among men. So I'm not saying you're not awesome, but Jesus doesn't lie. And Jesus says he's a great figure. And he also baptizes Jesus. So when Jesus is 30 years old, he is the one that baptizes Jesus. A dove descends from the skies. God cries out from heaven saying, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." And so he's the one that starts Jesus' public ministry. Now, one of my favorite stories in all of Scripture happens in John chapter 3, kind of around this moment, where John has been building a following, building disciples. He's talking about the Messiah who is to come. Jesus shows up onto the scene. He starts to lose some of his followers because they start leaving him and start following Jesus instead. And so some of the religious leaders are like, basically, "John, What are you going to do about it? Are you cool with this? And then John chapter 3, verse 30, he responds to the religious leaders by saying, I must decrease and he must increase. That everything I'm doing is to point people to Jesus and this Messiah. He is now here, so of course people should follow him. So he was a faithful prophet, but life did not end well for him. Eventually, a couple years after starting Jesus' earthly ministry, essentially, he ends up in prison. He ends up in prison because the establishment doesn't like him for calling out hypocrisy. He's always calling out religious leaders for saying one thing and doing another. Eventually, he condemns Herod, which is kind of the governor of Judea, the Jerusalem area of which they lived in the Roman Empire. He condemns Herod for divorcing his wife and then unlawfully taking the wife of his brother. So Herod divorces his wife, marries Herodias, which was his brother's wife, and John says, that's not cool, that's unlawful, you shouldn't be doing that. Now, what's interesting is Herodias doesn't like this, and so she's trying to find ways to imprison John, but the problem is Herod was worried about the crowds and John's disciples. Like he was worried if I arrest John for anything, they might start a riot. Well, eventually, Herodias kind of convinces Herod to arrest John for calling them out, essentially for getting married. But then the question is, why does he not just execute him right away? The problem is, if John was a free man, or at least according to their logic, he could lead a riot, but his death might incite a riot. And so he's in jail, but they can't get rid of him because they're afraid of the crowds. They don't want him to start a rebellion, essentially. Now, what's interesting is that when John the Baptist is in jail, Herod apparently at least once, probably more likely multiple times, would converse with John. And he was actually really intrigued by his teachings and by his wisdom. At the same time, he, of course, is frustrated with him for calling him out, which is why he is in jail. What's interesting is that in Matthew chapter 11, John the Baptist, you can read about him in every gospel in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 11, we see this story where John the Baptist is in jail, and he's essentially corresponding to Jesus through his disciples and is like, are you this Messiah that I had been proclaiming? Because I was faithful to you, and I'm in jail, and things aren't going the way that I thought that they would, right? John thought as a faithful prophet, as a faithful follower of the Messiah, certainly he wouldn't be jailed or imprisoned for him. Jesus essentially responds and says, yes, I am who you said that I am, but things are not going to end well for you in this life. Ultimately, John does not get out of prison, and he's executed, and here's how that happens. It was Herod's birthday. They were throwing him a big banquet, and at this banquet, Herodias' daughter, one of her daughters, comes and dances before Herod and the rest of the people in the official court. And after she danced, she goes up to Herod, and Herod says to her, ask me anything that you want, and I will give it to you. So Herodias' daughter then leaves the banquet, goes talks to her mom, Herodias, Herod's wife, asking what should she ask for. And Herodias at this time uses this opportunity to say, go tell Herod that you want John the Baptist's head on a silver platter. And so she goes back into the temple or into the banquet hall, tells Herod that she wants John's head on a platter. She wants John killed. And John is actually sad by this. Herod is actually sad by this because although he's frustrated with Herod or with John, he actually likes them, but he has to save faith. He can't go back on his oath in front of everybody else. And so John the Baptist is beheaded and is killed for ultimately being faithful to Jesus. And so that's just a few minute snippet version of John the Baptist.